is Jim Hatfield of the University of Kansas. We are looking at prehistoric human resilience in the Aleutian Islands.
So I'm going to apologize right away. I can see it messed up my text. I prepared my talk on a Mac, so it looks like there may be some problems, but hopefully nothing too bad. So I want to talk a little bit about the prehistoric human resilience in the Aleutian Islands. This is mostly data from some research that we've been doing in the islands of the Four Mountains, and these are all of the people who have contributed to data to this talk. And it's also going to include some findings from work on Alaska, from Shimya, and from Adak Island. And a lot of these researchers have been working in the Aleutian Islands for a long time. This is an international, interdisciplinary team of scientists. We have archaeologists, Dixie West, myself, and Kel Bruner. We have geologists like Brianne McInnes and Francis Griswold who are looking at tsunami evidence in the islands of the Four Mountains. And Lyman Persico and Henry Lemon looking at the geomorphology. They were specifically looking at glaciations on Jugenidak. And please also correct me for my mispronunciations. We have Mitsuru Okuno, who we had hoped would be on the island by now, but he's in Anchorage with probably many of our friends. And he is from Japan, and he looks at the tephras and reconstructs the history of the volcanic eruptions. And that's really useful for archaeologists and for understanding where people are in time once you have them dated. And then also we have Arkady Savnetsky and his colleagues at the Russian Academy of Sciences who do paleoecology. They're doing reconstruction of the environment and also looking at the animal species that prehistoric peoples were eating in the Aleutian Islands. And that gives us a lot of information both about what the temperatures were like as well as what was available to them. And then we have Susan Crockford, another zooarchaeologist who also looks at fauna, and we'll talk about her research. Olga Kralevich works with Arkady. And then Kirsten Nicolaisen at Whitman College is a geochemist who studies lavas, and she's been working in the islands of the Four Mountains and has also done a little bit of obsidian work on Adak. And Pavel Izbekov is also a volcanologist and covers everybody. He's with the UAF and has been helping understand again the volcanology in the islands of the Four Mountains. So they've contributed slides. So try not to ask questions about that I don't know the answers to, because some of these are not for me. So I think archaeology and looking at past environments through the human lens, an archaeological lens, is very useful to understanding situations now. These are kind of like little archival data sets that have information about climate, about how humans dealt with sudden changes like volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and tsunamis, as well as long-term climate change and species change that changed how they hunted and what they hunted. So in this talk, I'll be talking about human resilience in the face of volcanic eruptions, and earthquakes and tsunamis, glacial advances and retreats, and climate fluctuations and ecosystem changes, including some that were caused by humans. So in case you don't know where the Aleutians are, and this also shows what islands I'll be talking about, where they're located. So Shimya is over in the near islands on the furthest west, and Adak in the central Aleutians. Islands of the Four Mountains are about 150 miles west of us here, and then on Alaska. And these are 4 places where we've been doing research and getting information about how humans have lived in the Aleutians in the past. So first I want to talk about a very dramatic event on Kasatochi in 2008. I imagine many of you remember this. If you hadn't heard the story, I'm going to tell it here. There was a cabin here that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had with some bird biologists who pretty much were there every year and perhaps year-round studying bird populations. And in 2008, they suddenly started getting increasing numbers of earthquakes. The Alaska Volcano Observatory had no equipment on this island to monitor volcanic activity. And so when they reported the earthquakes, and they radioed into U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they called up AVO, they got pretty concerned and started using their equipment on other volcanoes, and realized that they needed to get those bird biologists off pretty quickly. And the Coast Guard wasn't close enough, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife didn't have a vessel close enough, and it ended up kind of last minute, a fisherman from Adak Island pulled them off, and 30 minutes later, the volcano erupted, and where their cabin is where this gentleman is standing in the orange suit on the right, covered by a pyroclastic flow. The littoral zone was completely buried by pyroclastic flow. The coastline was changed. It impacted bird populations. It impacted the intertidal species pretty severely. And you can imagine that in prehistoric times, people who were living under these conditions, they probably could relocate pretty fast in their boats, but then they wouldn't be able to resettle in this area like these birds tried to do as they came back to nest in the same places and are putting eggs down on ground that does not cover their eggs and were thus impacted pretty severely by predation. But their behaviors had them come back to these areas. And people are studying the changes that have happened to the coastline and to the ecology of this island. So it's going to be interesting to see how quickly how quickly this island revitalizes when populations come back. And so we look at volcanic eruptions. I mentioned it's pretty useful for archaeologists to date. It's also a good understanding of just the history of the volcanology of the region. This is a slide from Carlisle Island from peat deposits. And Mitsuru Kuno has dated several of these ashes. I wish I had a pointer as well. You can see the one labeled CRO2 tephra. Or ash, sometimes I call it an ash, same thing. I'm going to be talking about that. He has just recently gotten these dates that date it roughly at 1,000 years ago. You can see above and below, he gets dates on organic matter from the peat deposits. And then we have that very thin one that says thin vitric ash, which I think is kind of fun. And this is a very thin ash deposit that he believes came from Okmok on Umnak. So we have some evidence of other volcanoes a little further away impacting this island as well. So he has dates down for this sequence to 6,000 years ago. And then this is one of the archaeological sites. We had several units excavated on it. And so on the left, Unit 2, all of our deposits are above the CRO2 ash, which is marked there in yellow. And these are all, across the site. So it's nice that we have this ash, and wherever we go now, we can see if we're above or below 1,000 years ago. And we had deposits dated down to 3,600 years ago, or 36 to 3,800 years ago. That's a bottom of a house deposit for that date. So you can see a little house pit that they dug in there. And those black lenses are house floors. So we have really good stratigraphy and good idea of human occupation on Carlisle Island from about, we believe the last occupation was when the Russians were there, AD 1765. So that date, radiocarbon dates can't be that precise, but we're pretty sure that that's roughly when that most recent occupation would have occurred. And then you can see it was occupied periodically, based on the dates we have, maybe continuously, but more likely periodically from 4,000 years ago to Russian contact. These are the ashes that have been dated on Adak Island, and it's showing a similar thing. You can put cursor. No. ADK 171 is the oldest site dated in the central Aleutians. And it's just above that intermediate ash. The 6,000 years ago is an uncalibrated date, so you'll see it at 7,000 years in a minute, so don't be alarmed by that change. Sorry about that. Okay. I'm going to sum all this up later. So the tsunami research done on the Islands of the Four Mountains by Brianne McGinnis and Francis Griswold mainly identified the earthquake that was a very big earthquake in 1957 that maybe some people remember. And they discovered this, through lots and lots of digging of very deep holes through boulders and finding the sands that are associated with these tsunamis. We did not find in the islands of the Four Mountains that any of the prehistoric sites were impacted by the tsunamis, and I'll talk about why that is. They were pretty smart about where they put their sites. So we don't think that we think they're fully aware of the consequences of tsunamis and knew where to place their sites. Okay, so this is a GIF. This is going to show you the changes in sea level and the glaciers through time from about 20,000 years ago up until present day. So you can see there's been dramatic changes in coastline from 17,000 years ago to present. And our first peoples in the Aleutian Islands are found on Hog Island, these are the earliest states, and on Anegula Island, just off the coast of Nikolsky. And following that, the earliest state in the Central Aleutians is on Adak, I mentioned, 7,000 years ago, and then in the Western Aleutians, 3,500 years ago. So we see this kind of slow colonization going out to the western chain. Now this may be impacted by sample size. It's very hard to conduct archaeology in the Aleutians. It's very expensive, as you may guess, and hard to get out there, and then the weather isn't very cooperative. So here's an example of some of the work on glaciations. This is Tana, one of the volcanoes on Chuganadak. In the background is Cleveland, which is currently erupting and under observation by the Alaska Volcano Observatory. On the right is Carlisle, and on the left is Herbert, which has already blown its top. And this is a photo showing some of the glacial scarring that Lyman Persico identified on Tana. And he identified the extent of the late Holocene moraines and sort of the limits of where these glaciers were in the Holocene. And so the impact on humans, it probably was mostly a great source of water, the glaciers. Back in the earlier, like 18,000 years ago, may have been a barrier and maybe why we don't see people out in the Aleutians earlier than 9,000 years ago. But after people have occupied the Aleutians, they didn't have much of an impact. So a lot of our analysis is giving us information about climate change, and we see this from Adak Island's Haven Lake deposits, which has been used to reconstruct the environment there and see where they can see very cold spells and much warmer spells. And we're doing the same thing with peat bog deposits from Carlisle. That's still being, that analysis is still ongoing, so we don't have those results. In animal remains, as I mentioned before, what species they're eating can also give us information about what the climate was like at what time in prehistory. These vertebrae are showing you saffron cod on the left and a modern day specimen of how many? Pacific cod. I'm going to talk faster. And the saffron cod only occur where it's much colder. So this is evidence that 7,000 years ago that time in Adak Island was a much colder time period. And this is a much more harder to read slide that's showing you kind of the same information, that we're looking at these archaeological sites and we can compare them across the chain, look at the different species they're eating, and get information about the ecology of each of these areas through time. And we were also able to identify that fox did live on Carlisle Island before the Russians put foxes out there. So how did the Unanga survive in this tough region? And with all of these dramatic geological events? Well, of course, they passed down knowledge and knew the signs of tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. They had very mobile lifeways. They were they were expert seafarers. They were very good at building houses. They had very mobile toolkits that they could replicate from the rocks that you find on most of these islands. And they had a very complex social network and could rely on neighbors and that to help them. And they had a very productive, diverse ecosystem that was flexible, that they could utilize in a flexible way. So I'm going to kind of fly through these photos of kayaks and subterranean houses that really were well built for a windy climate. The one on the right is showing what it looks like when it collapses, and The one on the left is a historic drawing of an ancient Brabra. This is an example of the diversity of kinds of houses across the chain. Here at the bottom right on Unalaska, this is the Margaret Bay site. They had rock foundations. They had subfloor features that we think are related to heating. I'll talk about that more. At2, big circular houses without stone features. Adak, they had some heating features, but no stone. It's interesting. And then on Carlisle, you can see some rectangular houses that we think are influenced by the Russians. But on other islands in the islands of Four Mountains, we see circular houses, much like we see in the central and western Aleutians. This is from the Macnac Bridge site, showing you these heating features, chimneys, fireplaces, trenches that maybe shuttled heat along the floor. Here's a close-up of that hearth or chimney feature. And Susan Crockford and some others are arguing that this was an innovation during a very cold time period to deal with the cold, and then this particular feature disappears. That's something we kind of need to test and get more samples of to see if that holds up, but it clearly indicates that they were adapted to, colder times. The rich maritime ecosystem, I know you guys have been talking about a lot of the different fish and birds that occur in this area. They had access to many sea mammals, many kinds of fish, of course, diverse invertebrates, migratory waterfowl, and of course they also had terrestrial birds that they would eat. They were locating their settlements in places that they knew would be ideal, such as this is very high up, 50 meters. I can't remember how many feet that is, but pretty high up. And you can see all those little green dots are houses. They had a pretty big village here. They also located them along good water sources. And they were also, using creatures to create their rain gear. And they had very good rain gear. And their hats, very well designed for hunting and living in the Aleutian Islands. And they used plants for fuel, for medicine. They were very well versed in what they could do with all of the resources they had at hand. And they had a pretty well-suited chipstone technology that they used as hafted knives for projectiles, for harpoons, scrapers for scraping hides. They also used ground stones like ulus. I'm sure everybody's familiar with ulus. They had stone lamps. This is one of the main ways they would stay warm. They would stand over a lamp if they were cold and in their houses and get warm. So those fireplaces are kind of unusual since the ethnographic record indicates they mostly use those. And then we also have a lot of net sinkers. So we know they had very elaborate fishing technology. There's a variety of bone technology. I only showed you a handful here. Fish hooks that are specially designed for halibut or for cod. Here is a bird hunting dart. We found one element that belongs to that. We also found an element for a throwing board pin, and if you guys have heard of atlatls or throwing boards, that's what that little pin would have been for, and that just helps them have greater accuracy and velocity for their hunting. And they also had eyed needles, and those are very important for cold weather. They had a diversity of the raw material, the stone material, including obsidian, which is a wonderful material to use to make stone tools, as well as basalts and jaspers that you can find on your beaches right outside. Okay, in sum, we have people appearing on Anagula and Hog Island around 9,000 years ago. It's much colder than today. And then on Adak Island, 7,000, again, a colder period. And at 3,500 on Shimei Island, another cold spell. And it seems that they are colonizing during times when the storms are less, when you have this weakened cyclonic activity. So it may have been more conducive to travel in the Aleutians. So they endured, I've already talked about this, they've endured the volcanic eruptions. In this profile, you have occupation. It does seem like that the CrO2 ash caused a temporary abandonment. We have our most recent occupation roughly 200 to 400 years ago. And then following that, right before that eruption happened, about 1100 all the way back to about 4,000 years ago. They were living on Carlisle Island. On Alaska, 3,500 to 2,500, the climate was a lot more like what it is like on St. Lawrence Island today. We found, Susan Crockford found at this site, this is going to be the Margaret Bay or Magnetic Bridge site, bones of bearded seal, walrus, I think it's Margaret Bay, and ringed seal. Okay, it's Magnetic Bridge. It's Magnetic Bridge, sorry, I should have written that down. And this indicates that these are sea ice loving creatures. So this indicates that at that time, sea ice was occurring yearly, if not year round, in this area. But it also indicates that people were well adapted to living in this increased cold period. So I'll just conclude. The past does inform the present. I think we could learn a lot from how humans lived. I think we could design our houses a little better. On the right is a picture of the military housing out on Adak that's just, blowing away. And these semi-subterranean homes were a little bit more conducive to high winds. So. And we can learn a lot from archaeological sites. They do provide a window into human adaptation and the socio-natural systems that they lived in. So that's it. I want to thank National Science Foundation and the Keck Foundation, as well as our many partners in the Unalaska community for helping on this project. We had Jeff Dickrell as well have his school kids sort some of our remains, so we've been very grateful for all the support and interest that we've had here. So thank you very much.